and the title of this discussion is The Marxist View of the State and the Role of the Police. What role does the state play in capitalist society? In short, the capitalist state is an organisation of capitalist class rule. There are a number of different institutions that comprise what we call the state. In parliamentary democracies, there are elected governments and a permanent apparatus of administrators. The state can be described as an organisation that claims a monopoly of the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. The judicial branch and the military and police forces together make up the management of violence wing of the state. This management of violence wing of the state is supposed to be politically independent of governments. Important to emphasise that senior civil servants are unelected and handpicked to ensure that they are ideologically committed to defending the status quo. They are also paid the types of salaries that guarantee that they are kept out of touch with the living standards and outlook of working people. For example, the current police commissioner in Ireland is on a salary of €250,000 a year, while the chief executive of the Public Health Service in Ireland is paid an annual salary of €350,000 a year. The common sense notion about the police is that they are a politically neutral institution. Even if we accept that the police force simply acts to uphold the laws favour the interests of big business and the super rich, not working class people. The judges, the police, the armed forces, and senior civil servants certainly don't stand above politics. To create an aura of impartiality, the labour courts may even sometimes find in the interests of workers. They usually find in the interests of workers under pressure from organised labour, it should be said. But on balance, the record shows that the state's main function is to safeguard the wealth and resources of the ruling class and big business, to the detriment of working people. Electing a left government with left-wing policies cannot constitute a worker state. For example, if Bernie Sanders had been elected president, imagine the resistance he would have faced, not just from the Democratic Party, but from the top civil servants who would refuse to implement any left-wing policies. The Syriza government failed to mobilise working class people, failed to warn of the dangers of the ruling class, and they would have faced resistance from civil servants if they had have tried to implement radical policies. A worker state is a state that really represents the interests of the majority in society. Therefore, the ready-made machinery of the state must be smashed. Top civil servants, judges, and the tops of the army must be removed and replaced by the authority of workers' councils and representatives who are subject to recall and paid no more than the average worker's wage. We must be clear on explaining the nature of the capitalist state and what a worker state is to anyone who joins our organisation. We are not a reading circle or a book club. Our ultimate aim is to assist the working class in overthrowing capitalism. In our public work, we are aiming at the most advanced layers, not the layers of the working class with the average political consciousness. However, we don't write smash the state or argue for workers' defence forces in our leaflets about police violence. I'll give examples of recent demands we've put forward in relation to the police later on. Police officers tend to lean towards the right politically because their job consists of defending the status quo. In the 2012 elections in Greece, 7% of the electorate voted for the fascist Golden Dawn party. whereas half the police in Greece voted for Golden Dawn that year. 84% of cops planned to vote for Trump in 2016 elections. And the FBI had to vet the cops in Washington, D.C., who were tasked with policing Biden's inauguration last week or the week before. There were serious concerns about links between security officials and white supremacist groups. There is a long history of racist and political policing in the US and Brazil. The military police, which is a paramilitary division of the police in Brazil, overwhelmingly support Bolsonaro. This division has a particularly violent history stretching back to Brazil's slave plantations. The division was actually founded in response to ruling class fears about the impact of the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution was the first mass uprising to explicitly overthrow the slave system in the Western Hemisphere. Even today, the logo of Rio's military police force still features a crown above cross-colonial pistols, guns, flanked by sugarcane. The US ruling class launched what's called the SWAT, Special Paramilitary Division of the Police, in the 1960s. This paramilitary division was set up to wipe out the Black Panther Party in particular, and to intimidate the youth movement that was building in the 60s. In terms of the policing of worker struggles, I'll give one example. The British state developed a military-style occupation of coal mining areas during the 1984 miners' strike. There were 11,000 arrests, countless examples of police violence, roadblocks, and false prosecutions. Under the British Prime Minister's guidance, the secret police and other special units were mobilised not only to spy on the National Union of Mine Workers, but to employ agents provocateurs at the highest level of the union. Special units of the police are paid extra and are ideologically indoctrinated. They are told that you are working for the good of the country. These striking miners are trying to destroy the future of this country. There has been a radical expansion of police in the last 40 years that went along with the massive transfer of wealth from working people to the super rich in this period. This is connected to the defeats and setbacks of the 1980s and 1990s. It's no accident that the so-called war on drugs in the US was launched at the same time as increased unemployment and underemployment and attacks on unions. The war on drugs, it was basically the practice of courts giving much longer sentences for minor drug possessions. The disappearance of jobs created a hopelessness in areas of deindustrialization, where you've had an increase in drug use, drug sales, and antisocial behaviour. So law and order policies can gain an echo amongst the middle class, but also working class people who are also distrustful of the police, but fear a rise in crime. With the whole-scale privatisation of housing in recent years, you have more evictions of tenants, of renters. And police are duty-bound to come to the defence of landlords if they want to evict their tenants. In the south of Ireland and many other countries, there is no security of tenure. That's no security for renters. Problems like homelessness and serious mental illness are not treated as problems of inadequate housing and mental health care. These problems are treated as public disorder and criminality problems. In the US, there are more people with serious mental illnesses in jails and prisons than in hospitals. A quarter of people killed by the police each year were in the middle of a mental health crisis when they were killed. In the US, the police are likely to arrive at the scene of a person having a mental health breakdown. Whereas in Britain, it's more likely that mental health professionals from the Public Health Service will be called to the scene. But that's if the person is white. If a black person in Britain is having a mental health breakdown, then it's more likely that the police will be called. Black people in the US are more than 3 times as likely as a white person to be killed by police. And I just want to touch on the popular myth of black on black crime. In the US, statistics actually show that perpetrators of violent crime are likely to commit their crimes against people of their own racial background, whether they be white, Latinx, or black, etc. Which makes sense as communities in the US are quite segregated on racial lines. In the UK, areas with the highest levels of violent crime and organised crime have always been in cities in the north of England, or Glasgow or Belfast, where you have large-scale deprivation, large-scale poverty. And these cities are overwhelmingly white. Yet there has been a media hysteria in recent years in Britain about black-on-black knife crime in London, perpetuating the myth of black criminality or the idea that black people are more likely to be violent. The police are much more likely to use excessive force against black men. In response to the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests, the Obama administration launched the Task Force on 21st Century Policing. This included reforms such as diversifying police forces, or putting body cameras on police, or training the police to be more communicative and to work without biases. These reforms made no meaningful difference in reality. Hiring more black police officers makes no difference at all in the levels of the use of excessive force. The mission they have is to conduct the war on drugs. That's the problem. That involves profiling and harassing young people who live in areas of high unemployment. Eric Garner, a black man in New York, was confronted and killed by police for the supposed crime of selling cigarettes without a license. The use of body cameras has brought no decline in the number of complaints made against the police, or the number of injuries that people suffer when in police custody. People who make complaints that they've been abused or mistreated by the police and ask for footage aren't given the footage by the cops. The cops refuse to give footage to the media when a cop is accused of a crime. Whereas if police manage to save someone from a car crash, for instance, they immediately release the footage to the media for public relations reasons. When an officer is involved in a shooting that kills someone, charges are brought forward in only 2% of cases, and an officer is convicted in less than 2% of those cases. So they almost always get away with murder. Marxists need to oppose the extension of police powers, even in complicated situations. Following the storming of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., there were many calls for more police on the streets, and the criminalization of far-right protesters. We have to say no to criminalisation of protest. The way to combat the far right is through politically and sometimes even physically confronting them and undermining them, through counter protests and the building of anti-racist and anti-capitalist campaigns. The establishment will often use a crisis situation, such as an economic crisis or natural disaster, to crack down on civil liberties and extend police powers. The COVID pandemic was used as an excuse to extend police powers in the south of Ireland in April 2020. Emergency legislation was introduced to say that no public gatherings of more than 4 people could take place. And ordinary people often supported this idea as they felt that police needed to stop people who are breaking the social distancing restrictions. Our representative in Parliament, Mick Barry, was the only elected representative in Parliament to stand against it and warn of the dangers. Opportunist pressure is a very real danger for revolutionaries. That's why you need a cadre organisation with a grounded cadre steeped in both theory and experience. You need a certain quality of a membership that can withstand the pressure of public opinion. Unlike the ISA in Ireland, Paul Murphy, who was an elected representative, a former member of our organisation. Paul Murphy and the Cliffites in Ireland. The Cliffites are a sort of a semi-Trotskyist organisation in Ireland. Paul Murphy and the Cliffites, they supported the emergency legislation, and basically they bent to the pressure of bourgeois public opinion. The extension of police powers is usually not a temporary phenomenon or a temporary measure. In the past in Ireland, emergency legislation such as the Offences Against the State Act was brought in under the guise of tackling the IRA armed terror campaign. People were concerned about the danger of IRA bombs and robberies, so a lot of people may have supported the legislation. But the extra powers for the police were then used to criminalise trade unionists, student activists, feminist activists, and anti-water charge activists. It must be pointed out as well that police are disproportionately much more likely to have intimate partner violence against their partner than the general population of men or women even. The same goes for men in the army. Men in the army, they're trained killers, and then they're much more likely to be use intimate partner violence in their relationships. In France, a state of emergency suspending freedom of assembly, freedom of movement was introduced in 2015 following terror attacks in Paris. The state of emergency lasted 2 years, but was then replaced by a draconian anti-terror law in October 2017. The new law gave French police the power to carry out arbitrary searches of private homes. And it gave them the power to collect and store all electronic, email, and telephone data of anyone police suspect of being connected in the present or future to the vague term serious crime. The extended police powers have seen an escalation of police repression against protesters across France. Since 2018, tens of Gilets jaunes or Yellow Vest movement protesters. Tens of these protesters have lost eyes to beanbag bullets or hands to police grenades. In the space of one day in December 2018, almost 9,000 people were detained, in the greatest number of mass arrests in French history since the Nazi occupation. Macron even ordered the army to fire live rounds on protesters in March 2019. Macron woke bay. It was the first time this happened since a major strike wave in 1947. Most people would see the need for day-to-day policing, and that the role of the police is to keep the peace or to protect and serve. Although there is a growing consciousness about problems with the police, many people understandably have concerns about aggressive begging in the streets where they live or drug dealing in their local parks. We have to connect these problems with the need for social change and put forward transitional demands. I have some demands here from our US section that were put forward during the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. Immediately fire and prosecute all cops who have committed violent or racist attacks. End the militarization of police. Put policing under the control of democratically elected civilian boards. Massively defund police and reinvest those funds into schools and affordable housing. The slogan of defund the police became a major slogan in the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer, but it's ultra left if you don't connect it with the need for funding of schools, hospital services. And we said police unions are dominated by reactionaries that defend abuse of police and should not be given cover by the labour movement. I'm sure that Elgir will develop points around programme in the sum up. I would be very interested in insights from comrades from Israel, South Africa, Nigeria, and Hong Kong, Brazil, Russia, Italy, and other places on the issue of policing, and how we intervene using a transitional method. I'd also invite comrades from the north of Ireland who would have a good experience on this issue. Well, the north of Ireland is not a different section to the south where I'm based, but it's in a different state with different policing. So I'd invite comrades, please come into the discussion with questions or insights. Thanks for your time.